that's where Buddhism came from. Just this, I got to solve this problem of reducing suffering. And then the realization that we're so interconnected that we have to address other people's suffering too.
This is 10,000 Heroes, and I am Ankur Shah Delight. 10,000 Heroes is here to provide inspiration, intimacy, and maybe even a little bit of guidance for you as to what it means to live a truly purposeful life and how we can each get there in our own beautiful, individual, snowflake, flower petal way. So welcome back to the show. Our guest today is Dan Greening, a host of the Mindful Agility podcast and an experienced hand at both Agile methodologies, which is a computer thing, and mindfulness training, which is not. So I go deep with Dan on how he's found his way to the nexus of these two contradictory or perhaps complementary approaches. Let's jump in.
My background is I am a computer scientist and an entrepreneur with a few startups in my background. I had a big startup failure in 2007. And by big, I just mean it cost me a lot of money, of my personal money, despite being funded by the National Science Foundation and other, credential throwing organizations. And that failure was super disappointing to me. It was one of those, if you know Buddhism, it was one of those second arrow issues that I had a couple of previously successful startups. So who can complain? And then there I was, with this big failure, and I'm stabbing myself with this second arrow, thinking about what a loser I am and that sort of thing.
Okay. So I don't know that reference, but I think that's worthwhile enough to go into, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. So one of the sort of traditional Buddhist story is that a monk asked the Buddha, what causes suffering? And he tells this story about a person walking in the woods who gets struck by a poison arrow. And there are people around him. They bring a doctor, and the person struck by the arrow is angry. And that person says, I need to know, who was it that shot this arrow? And I want to know what is in this arrow. And they go, well, it's a poison arrow. We should take that out. And he goes, well, first, I want to know who it is. And I want to know what kind of poison it is. And I want to get them, I want to know who they are. And the Buddha goes, okay, so there's the harm of the first arrow, but the second arrow was caused by the person himself, that he was rejecting help, that he was creating his own suffering by delaying the withdrawing of the arrow. So when we talk about second arrows in Buddhism, the primary goal of Buddhism is to reduce suffering, and that's it. But it turns out that because we are so interdependent with others, reducing our own suffering means that we have to think about reducing other people's suffering. And basically, that's where Buddhism came from. Just this, I got to solve this problem of reducing suffering. And then the realization that we're so interconnected that we have to address other people's suffering too. And that a lot of our suffering is not caused by the direct, pain caused by our interaction with the world around us, but by our own attitudes about what is happening to us. So that second arrow term is often used by Buddhists to talk about self-directed harm.
So in your experience, the startup failure was the first arrow, but how that affected your ego and kind of your self-concept was the second arrow.
Exactly. So I was moping around. I mean, there were other things going on in my life. I had a cancer diagnosis and I almost went bankrupt, and
Okay, so there's some other minor extenuating circumstances.
minor issue.
I just had this cancer diagnosis, just other, yeah.
So I had surgery and radiation and I still had this company and I was in the process of shutting it down, but it was head and neck cancer. So the radiation was on my neck and it was causing bleeding. So I was riding the ferry from Sausalito, California to San Francisco every day to deal with the shutting down of my company while bleeding somewhat from my neck. I'm sure I was a sight to behold by my fellow passengers on the ferry. But then I would go to work, and then was I worrying about my cancer diagnosis or any of these other things? No, I was thinking about what a failure I was because this company had failed. And then I was moping around at work, and some of my colleagues said, I was going like, what did I do wrong with this company? And one of my employees handed me a book on an agile management technique called Scrum. Just handed me this book and said, you have to read this book. And I went, okay, what else am I doing besides shutting this company down? I'll do that. And so I read that book and then I went, holy crap, why didn't I read this 10 years ago, when it was written or when people were putting this stuff together. And then another friend handed me a book on a different agile technique called Lean Startup. And I read that book and I went, holy crap, this is great too. So then I was sort of engaged in agile topics. And I took my team and we all joined a company called Citrix. When we joined that company, I turned out to be the biggest agile advocate. They weren't using agile there. And our team was the experimental test bed for that. It turned out to work really well.
So just for a little bit of background, Agile is a suite of methodologies usually applied to running software companies, but I imagine it could be broader than that.
Yeah, exactly. So Agile techniques, I think, have these characteristics. They have a very short cycle time that someone says, I want to build a thing, and it's this giant thing. And then Agile asks, what can you deliver in a couple of weeks or maybe a month max that would address some of the problems or even the tiniest bit of problem that your long-term projects hopes to solve? Exactly. So all Agile techniques have these experimental mindsets about them with short cycle times. What that does is it helps eliminate delusions. Like when we start a company, we have this dream that everybody's going to like our technical solution to their, interesting problem. And then we discover no one cares. That's a very common experience among.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just because you build something beautiful doesn't mean there actually was a problem that other people had.
Right.
I've run into that a lot as an engineer.
Oh, you're an engineer too, so you know this. And so there are different techniques for different pieces of this puzzle. So one of the pieces of the puzzle is that when you have a team of creative people working together, they come to that team with their own set of knowledge, their own biases, their own skill sets, and their own capability to learn. And so every time you assemble a team, it's a little bit different. And the team doesn't know all the things it needs to know to build what you want to do. And so the experiments around building things, that's called Scrum. That is an agile technique, but it's around building things rapidly or efficiently. And the way I like to think of it is an engine, an experimental engine of low cost production. There's the other side, which is, are we building something valuable that customers want that they'll pay for. And on that side of the world, we have a technique called lean startup. So here, people create a hypothesis. Someone will want this particular product. And then that's only a hypothesis until we get some data to prove whether it's real or not. So one way to do that, of course, is to build the whole thing, and then put it in front of the market and say, see, we built this beautiful thing. We know you'll love it, right? So that doesn't always end well.
But you do get to spend a lot of money and use a lot of time in that approach.
And venture capitalists love you, at least until the very end. So in that world, the interesting thing about lean startup is you hang around with enough of these lean startup people, and you realize how many experiments you can run without spending hardly any money. So Paul Gross is one of the famous people in this space. Ideal Lab was his baby down in Los Angeles. He created Cars Direct. Cars Direct was a place where you could buy automobiles online, one of the first places that you could do that.
So without all the in-person haggling and going
exactly.
to the...
Right. But his hypothesis is that people didn't like high touch, go to the store, buy the car idea, that a lot of people just think of that as a big waste of time. They just want a particular car and they want it now. And they don't want to spend too much time haggling. So he said, well, we need to test this idea. So he hired an engineer and he said, let's build a website where you can put in the model that you want and the features that you want and all this stuff. And a person that was building this said, oh, okay. So started creating a database with all the features available and looking at how they could download the data or if it had to be manually input, and did all the things that you might imagine. And this guy came back and said, hey, how's it going? And he says, well, like I've got all of this stuff I have to do. He goes like, no. Let's strip that down. Let's make it so that all people have to do is enter their name and address, their phone number, their credit card information. We take a deposit, and then they just type into a text field the car they want and all the features that they want. Isn't that hilarious?
This is really like the definition of minimum viable product, right?
Exactly. That's yes. He may have been one of the people who coined that term, but anyway, he said, let's just do that. And the guy goes, well, what about the credit card? And he goes, we have to do all this stuff with the banks and stuff. He goes like, oh, no, don't worry about that. Just have a text field where you hit the submit button and it sends you an email with the credit card information. And he goes like, how do we process the credit card? He goes, I don't know yet.
I don't even know if that car exists yet, right? This is just getting interest.
It's a text field, right? So they finally get this thing done. They're in LA. The guy goes, is this done? And the engineer says, yeah, according to your definition of done. They put it online. I don't think they did any advertising. It was just sitting there, and they put it online on a Friday. The CEO comes back in on Monday and said, how'd it go over the weekend? Well, we got 4 car orders. And he goes, well, shut that sucker down because we have to honor these orders somehow. But what happened was we proved that people would use this tool, right? So it's worth spending more money to do the database potentially or do whatever is necessary beyond that. And then they spent, I think, 6 or 9 months. They hired people. They spent 6 or 9 months putting the real minimal viable product and put it in front of people. And then it became a big deal. And it sold, I want to say he sold it for $70 million or something like that. And, most of that was profit. So, or capital gains, I guess is what we should say. But so that's a good example of a minimum viable product according to the lean startup idea. You want to find the simplest, dumbest possible thing that you can do to test your market theory.
Okay. So I'm gonna take this back to your life. So you had this failure. You had this first arrow, you had this second arrow, you got this book recommendation, you read it, you learned two different ways of approaching the world. One has to do with how you run your team, kind of the back end side, and one has to do with how you relate to the market. And then how did that colonize your mind? How did that change your life? How did that bring you to where you are today?
So I became an agile coach. I became a person that taught these skills to companies. And what I found was
But hold on. Why? I mean, I'm assuming you've learned a lot of things in your life, a lot of different paradigms. You learned Buddhism at some point. You know, you have many domains of specialized knowledge that have changed your life in one way or another. What potential did you see in this that made you be like, oh, I need to drop everything and follow kind of in this path?
Well, I'm one of these bumbling adventurers that sort of discovers something cool, and then I just spend all my time with it as long as someone is paying my rent. So that's kind of where that came from in part. But the other part of it was just realizing, so I have a feeling of responsibility towards people wasting their lives. I want people all of us, to contribute more to the health and well-being of everyone. And I think a lot of us wander around in this fog of, what should I do next? Well, someone is telling me what to do, so I should do that because I'm kind of confused. But when I looked at these techniques, I said, oh, this is really great. These are kind of engines for us. One is an engine of how to efficiently use our time on the planet to build things. And the other is an engine to help us discover what things really matter to other people. And so the combination of those two, from a capitalist perspective, the combination of those two is profit, because you have revenue, which is what matters to people. What are they willing to pay for? And then you have cost, which is, the denominator of that fraction. And that cost is something you want to minimize for a particular thing. So those two things, Lean Startup and Scrum, work together to create a profit engine. And that profit engine can help you if you're a capitalist, but they can also help you if you're just trying to make the best use of your time on the planet to help more people live better.
Okay. So again, this is fabulous. And I want to just keep going to like these deeper levels here. So you discovered this profit engine. You could have just used it to generate a lot of profit, but instead you spent a lot of time teaching other people about how they could change their lives through it because you have a deeper concern. Like you said, it's really important to you that other people don't waste their lives. Where did that come from?
That is a good question. I don't know. Like when I was an undergraduate, I told my parents that I really wanted to go to the University of Michigan because that's where the hippies were. And when I did go, I joined a cooperative housing organization the first moment I got there. And I guess I was kind of a mini Marxist at the time because Marxism promises to help more people live better lives and all that stuff. And so to me, that was an experimental framework to test whether that theory was really true. So I got some benefit out of the cooperative housing experience. I met a lot of people. I figured out how to get along with more people. I figured out, what the limitations of that sort of perspective were. I think I ended up kind of hybrid capitalist Marxist, which sounds even almost impossible, but there it is, that I do think that we have to motivate people through reward systems in order to produce better stuff. And sometimes that even means rewarding people for managing other people in a way that creates better stuff. And so that becomes more compatible with capitalism. But I also saw people abusing the sort of cooperative system by basically slagging off and doing nothing while other people were doing a lot of work. So that's sort of where that started. But, like, how do I go wind even back further? Why did I want to hang out with hippies? I'm not sure.
Yeah. So that's a great kind of historical answer. But even in the present moment, I'm wondering, like, what is beneath that feeling of not wanting people to waste their lives for you, like right now? Like, why is that of such import to you?
Well, I mean, we all get stressed out by the news, and that impacts us negatively. It's our second arrow. We read about Donald Trump doing something lately, it's ridiculous that it's 2022 and we're still reading about Donald Trump. But you get stressed out one way or the other, whatever belief system you have. And why is that? It's because there's a lot of people around who are trying to optimize for themselves, as if themselves was a concept worth talking about, right? So the problem is people you look at rich people and there are a lot of unhappy rich people, right? And why is that? That's because they've been optimizing for their self as if there's some boundary between their self and others. And that boundary isn't really there. The other people and their happiness impinges on ours, or helps ours. And so, I don't know, it all.
Yeah, it's like an awareness of interconnectedness. You have a sense, and maybe some of it's empirical and some of it's theoretical, that other people's unhappiness or other people's happiness really contributes, in this kind of neural network way. It like feeds in to your happiness or unhappiness. And so it's important to you, even as a happiness maximizing individual. If you wanted to be so narrow, it would still be important to you to like work with everybody else.
Yeah, it's like enlightened self-interest. There's one thing about selfish self-interest in the sense that we can't see beyond, a couple of feet around us. But in fact, you and I are influenced dramatically by the interactions we have. You are going to be a different person because of this conversation, and I will be too. And then, so who gets the credit for whatever we do after this moment, right? Is it Ankur, or is it Dan, or is it the two of us, or the friends around us, or Donald Trump?
Or the engineers who built Zoom?
Yeah, Zoom. Oh, let's not forget them. You had your gratitude meditation this morning and thought about the people who made Zoom and how important they were to you. Awesome.
Yeah. So let's get back to the Agile bit, because what I sense you're doing, and this, I could be wrong here, but it seems like you took this business methodology, or specifically like almost like a tech methodology, and you're broadening it out and applying it to just how anyone can live their life. Is that right?
That's right. I'm doing two things at once. So the first thing is exactly that I've long thought that as individuals, we have an opportunity to just make our lives to suffer less. Okay. So Buddhism focuses on that and it helps. There is something that I've thought about. I came to Buddhism during that cancer diagnosis, right? I'd long been interested in it from the periphery, but then faced with a potential death, like my own death, and looking around me, I noticed that a lot of people were upset that I might keel over at any moment. And there were a lot of crying and all sorts of crazy. And then I became kind of a psychologist for my friends because I don't know that I was okay with it, but I go into fix it mode when stuff like that happens.
Yeah, you put on your like engineering solution brain, and
Exactly.
you're not tuned into the emotional experience of it as much.
Right. So I was digging around on Google Scholar for all of the articles, had a neck cancer and who was a specialist. And I was using my diplomatic skills to convince, surgeons that were well known that they should give me advice by email and that I wouldn't sue them if it, all went wrong. And they did, which was really sweet. But, and also at the same time, my friends are losing it a little bit. And I'm, just being as reassuring as I can be and letting them know that everything's going to be okay, but not knowing that it was going to be okay. And then sort of Buddhism kind of floated in and had messages about that seemed to resonate with me. And so I started adopting those strategies. But, and first of all, I should say I am what's called a secular Buddhist. So that means a Buddhist that doesn't believe in the mystical elements of many Buddhist religious sects. So I don't believe in reincarnation as is normally thought. I don't believe that I'm going to die and I'm going to be reincarnated as somebody else. I do believe, though, that I do survive this body, but how does that happen? It's exactly what we just talked about. Our interactions, what survives me is what I do while I'm alive. And the things that I do will ripple through other people and they can either make for a better future or a worse future. But, will I, in that selfish point of view, survive any of that? Not really. But I have a huge amount of influence over what comes after.
I want to go into a little more detail on that because I think it's worthwhile. So when you say the things that I do, that almost sounds a little too narrow for what I think you mean. So it's not just the actions, but it's like all of the ripples and consequences of all the ways you interact with the world. So it's like the words you say that are remembered by someone, in addition to like the things you build or the things you're seen doing or the memories that are made of you. It's all the ways you've affected other consciousness and also freestanding objects in the world that then could, in the future, interact with other consciousness.
That's right. That both of those things are true. And in a sense, we model when we act or how we treat other people are models for people and how they interact with others going forward. So if you're watching the Kardashians all day with their reactivity and like whiny, whatever it is, worried about bling and all that stuff, you're getting the Kardashian viewpoint. You are seeing the Kardashians as a model for your world, and you're going to start acting a little bit more like the Kardashians. Right.
It's just amazing how true that modeling is. I have this 5-year-old daughter, and a couple of weeks ago after dinner, she I don't know if she rang a bell or something. And she's like, "All right, now everyone, we're going to sit in a circle in the living room, and one at a time, we're all going to go into the center. We're going to share about our days." And it was just the kind of like facilitation exercise that my wife and I would just do typically as part of our work. And she had just somehow observed or picked up on that. And she was like, "I'm going to facilitate this little sharing for everyone at this dinner party." She's 5, or maybe she was 4 at that point.
Oh my God, your guest must have been charmed beyond belief.
Yeah, it was hilarious. But it was just like, oh yeah, this is the modeling that we don't even know we're doing, but clearly we're doing a lot of facilitated interactions.
Yeah, that's amazing. So secular Buddhists are materialists in the sense of, philosophy. We just believe in physics and all that stuff. But there are we have built this conceptual model of how we interact in our communications and all that stuff. And we can leave the world a better place for people or animals or the world in general. And I guess I have resonated more and more as I've studied Buddhists in this sort of atheistic way that really helps me think about the world, think about other people, and treat people better, and not lose my mind when people slight me or treat me less than I would prefer, or whatever it is. I have found it to be very beneficial for me in terms of stabilizing.
Yeah. So you found a way to get the helpful bits out of religion without the unhelpful bits.
Yeah.
It's kind of how I would put it.
Yeah, there you go.
But let me ask a question before we get to back to the agile mindset stuff. Just because you identify as a materialist, I'm just curious. I really like to use this word purpose a lot. I'm just curious how you think of purpose in general and how you think of the evolution of your understanding of your own purpose.
So I'll start with the way I think about purpose. So so it's going to relate to Agile right away, actually. Great. As an Agile coach, I'm here to teach people how to use this experimental framework to do more work in less time, and also to build things that are more appealing to other people. When you deal with large corporations, so I was the head Agile coach for Skype, for Citrix, you're dealing with 1,000 people or so, and you find out that the alignment of people within these organizations is very important to whether they can achieve the bigger goal. A lot of times we approach our jobs is looking at our job description, and then we think, oh, if we just do our little job description, we will be able to, I don't know, make a salary. Like, it's so limited what we're talking about. Like, I'm going to make a salary and I'm going to support my family. Yeah, they know that's great. But no one ever tells us, why are we doing this? Right? Like, are we building Skype so that people can communicate better with each other and create a harmonious world? Are we keeping people secure so they can have more conversations that lead to higher levels of democracy or freedom, or what is it we're doing? When I would talk to individuals within an organization, one of the first things I would ask them is, what is the purpose of your organization? Why are you contributing to this organization versus being in a different organization? And that was very confusing for many people. They hadn't really thought about it, and then as you talk through it with people, you discover that some of the things that were impeding their personal goals in the organization were the fact that they couldn't communicate with people around them using the language of the shared purpose. Right. So one example is I worked with a project manager at the LA. So this is actually not a big corporation. This is just a little project manager in the LA County Department of Health. So she's a friend of mine, and I said, I'm doing Agile coaching for my friends for free, just to figure out, does it work for individuals and in their situation outside software? And she said, oh, okay, so I have an issue. I've got this grant, and I think I'm not going to be able to achieve the criteria on the grant. And it's bumming me out. I go like, okay, look, let's spend time on that. So I said, so what's the goal of the LA County Department of Health? Because she was having conflicts with other people. She wasn't able to get stuff done that she needed to get done for the grant. And she said, well, I guess health. I'm going, okay, let's try to, we don't know what the mission statement is for the LA County Department of Health. And furthermore, if we go to the declared mission of the LA County Department of Health, it's going to be some mealy-mouthed kind of corporate, some stupid thing, right? So let me suggest that the LA County Department of Health's purpose is to raise the level of health for the most vulnerable people in LA County. And she said, that sounds good. And then I said, okay, so great. So let's just memorize that phrase, because you're going to use that when you talk to other people in the department. You're going to be more articulate than any of your other colleagues who haven't thought about the mission. And then so now you can approach people and say, well, remember, our mission is to raise the level of health for the most vulnerable people in LA County. And my role in that is to do this grant. And this grant does X, Y, and Z. And this is how it helps those most vulnerable people. I need your assistance in that. I need you to help me with this grant, because look at how much better things will be when you contribute in that role. And things started to open up. She was able to use that as a diplomatic.
So you're like kind of kicking it up Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Exactly.
Like let's appeal to something deeper here to get more buy-in.
And shared, right? So no one ever said it, and maybe they never thought about it explicitly, but they are all there roughly for that reason. And having that as a shorthand, having the purpose be your shared communication mechanism means that so many things are possible. One of the things that we've talked about is I have a podcast called the Mindful Agility Podcast. And the purpose of that is to combine these concepts of agile with these concepts of mindfulness. So one example is a friend who wanted to become a vegan. And she has a family, she has a couple of kids. One of the kids is allergic to legumes, which is almost a non-starter, but she just plowed into it headlong and started eating vegan. The rest of the family was not having that. And she did have to she did say, like my son who's allergic to legumes, I'm just going to cook cheese and meat and stuff like that for him. But she started having all sorts of stresses, and she started for her, there was a second arrow, which was she was separating herself from the rest of the family, and she was creating this artificial barrier. And she wouldn't be thinking, she'd be working in the kitchen, and she would eat a piece of cheese, and then she would feel guilty about eating cheese, right? And her husband was upset, and one thing led to another. And then she said, okay, I quit, right? Like, so it was 100% vegan or 0% vegan, right? Like those were the choices. And then she did that for a while. And then she decided to approach it with a sense of purpose. So why was she a vegan? So she said she had values that related to wanting to be kind to other beings. She wanted to, I think health was not the factor, but being kind and being harmonious with other beings was the most important part. And then she had a conversation with her husband, who she's a nurse and her husband is a nurse too. And he said, well, I believe in that stuff too, but I think eating meat is sort of what our type of animal does. And I think of it as harmonious with this notion of being kind to beings. We're all part of a big system. And she goes like, okay, I can understand that purpose. So I have a belief that we shouldn't eat meat, but I can see how you can fit your beliefs into this greater purpose as well. And so that sort of softened her hard stance about veganism and made it possible for her to relate more to her husband in these situations. And then she also decided that she was going to give herself a break if she had a piece of cheese, or if her son was having ice cream and she said, wow, that ice cream sure looks good. it was going to be okay if she took a spoon and went like, I'm going to have a taste of that ice cream. So she became what she calls a 95% vegan. But here's what happened. So now that she was kind of a softer vegan, she's in this family, she's cooking tempeh and, tofu and all the good stuff that vegans love. And it's there, and the rest of her family is starting to eat some of it. And they're going like, hey, this is all right, and she still has to be concerned with her son with legumes, but now they have oftentimes 100% vegan meals. And the other people don't call themselves vegan, but even though she says she's 95% vegan, in a way, because she embraced the purpose, she's become 150% vegan in a sense, right? Like she has spread this idea beyond herself because she had this sort of better understanding of interdependence. She was compassionate towards people around her. There were so many more opportunities that opened up because she was kind to herself and to people around her and incorporated them into her decision-making and her direction.
Yeah. And it seems to me, and I love the outcome of that story. It seems to me that there's also an important role of non-judgment here. Like if she was coming at it with this kind of combative, we should all do X. And then later through this higher purpose work, she learns that she and her husband have the same ideals. They just have different ways of like understanding it, going about it. Then she doesn't have to judge herself. She doesn't have to judge her husband. And that whole layer can dissolve and allow for the whole thing to be more fun.
Yeah. Yeah. It sure sounds fun. I asked her recently if she was still 100% happy. And she did say she was. She really is having a good time. So I like that. But so from the purpose point of view, then you go to these corporations, the same issues apply here, right? And so one example I have from Skype is that I was in a team and one team member in particular was complaining that Skype had advertising. And I said, oh, okay, so we should charge for Skype, the application then. And he said, no, it should be free and there shouldn't be any advertising. And I'm going like, okay, how do you get paid? Like what happens here? I mean, people are getting the advantage of your work and they are benefiting from that greatly. They need to contribute somehow to your livelihood because you've invested all this work and so forth. So either they have to endure,
Yeah, I mean, technically, the user doesn't have to pay. It's just like somebody has to pay.
Somebody has to pay, right? But in a way, the user does pay if you have advertising. In a sense, right? They pay because of their intellectual damage as a result of the advertisement.
Yeah, they pay for their every side of their personality being tracked and all their interests being cross-referenced. Yeah.
There's a phrase like that. If you don't know who's paying for the product is you. Anyway, so you find I found when I was dealing with, I've coached many individuals, randomly just injected into companies or at a conference or something. And we have conversations about challenges that they have. I mean, these experimental techniques are actually quite challenging. It's hard for people to sustain an experimental mindset with everything they do all day long, right? That's not common sense in a way. I mean, it should be common sense. It helps a lot with our progress and so forth, but intellectually it's draining to deal with that. And that's why we end up having agile coaches, because it's so hard to sustain that high performance perspective all the time.
Yeah. And so that actually reminds me, because I don't have background in this coaching philosophy, is there a whole network and like school of agile coaches, or are you like the agile coach?
The only one. Wouldn't that be awesome? There are lots of them. So there's an organization called the Scrum Alliance, which focuses on that cost saving side of the world. And I am a member of that organization. There's also a few other organizations, but that's the big one. I think there's like 50,000 Scrum. They're called Scrum Masters, is the lower level of the hierarchy.
Scrum Master is the lower level.
It is.
Scrum Grandmaster above that?
Yes, exactly. No, it goes. So there's sort of a Scrum Master, which is the first tier of classes that you can get, and then there's a advanced Scrum Master, and then there's a certified team coach, where you learn a little bit more about how to have inter-team coordination and other stuff like that. And then there's a certified enterprise coach, and that is the credential that I have. So that's the highest coaching credential. And then on the teaching side, there's basically, you are either a certified Scrum trainer or you're not. There's no in between or intermediate step. It does turn out that I can credential certified Scrum Masters. I just can't certify a giant room of them. I have to coach them through that process. But yes, there is a whole credentialing process around that. Also, there's an organization called the International Coaching Federation, which deals with coaching generally. Often life coaches get credentialed through that organization. And many members of the coaching community within the Scrum Alliance have credentials from the ICF. So, but I don't have one of those.
Okay. And then where, in your imagination of the impact you want to have and the way in which you want our society to transform as a result of the transformation of these individuals, what is this going to look like in 5 years? Like, what does success look like here?
All right. So then we talk about how Agile and mindfulness mash up and why they're needed, why they need each other. So one of the issues with mindfulness is there's a certain amount of passivity around it. Its purpose originally was to reduce suffering. So once you are able to attain that personal reduction in suffering by recognizing that you do have to be compassionate to people around you. So it is improving things around you, but it's sort of improving things immediately around you. And the bigger picture may be harder to conceptualize as an individual. So from a mindfulness perspective, we kind of worry about ourselves and our immediate surroundings first. On the Agile side, now we're in this hardcore world where people are experimenting with themselves and they're running these, metric-driven ideas about how's our work going? Are we producing more with less? And are we experimenting with our market by, putting up these crazy websites to test whether people will buy our cars and stuff? So that world doesn't talk about compassion. It's very interesting for me because I realized at some point that I was one of the few Agile coaches that would talk about how important compassion was for teams to interact well with each other and get more done and be happier. And sustainability is something that we talk about in Agile practice, but sustainability you get more sustainability if people are nicer to each other, right? If they care about the health and well-being of their teammates, of their customers, other people around them. And one of the things that we see in Agile practice is that it's hard to sustain. And what can happen is the misstep of an executive, such as making a decision to reorganize a company without thinking about the impact to this high performance methodology that people are using internally, when they just casually reorganize thinking that it'll all be fine because big companies do this all the time, like it has created huge disasters. So Yahoo, for example, was reorganized in a series of, they had an agile coaching group, I want to say in 2005 or something. They were delivering frequently, things were getting great. And then they went in and reorganized the whole thing, fired all the agile coaches because we were agile. So everybody knew what that was and we don't need coaches anymore. And then their release cycle got to, I think, 9 months. They would release a new version every 9 months rather than every month as they were doing before. And then they said, oh, what's wrong? I guess our agile transformation wasn't good enough because we hired the wrong coaches before. Let's hire a different set of coaches and we'll do it again. And they did it again and things got better. And then they said, oh, I guess our transformation is done. So we're just going to get rid of those coaches. And it's like, it just keeps going like that. So I guess part of the conclusion there is I think people have to be conscious of this interaction process. So coaches are useful and you probably want somebody around to help you do that all the time. Whether you switch them in or out is fine, but just throwing them out completely is probably not a good idea. And then the second thing is that being mindful of things, being aware of what is happening, being conscious of the interdependence of people around us and how all these teams interact with each other. That's something that is often missing certainly in executives. You can see how that would have a negative effect if you're not aware of how the different pieces of your organization interact with each other, even from the most intimate level. Then you could have problems. But we also, I think, see that when the individuals on the ground are aware of their interactions with other people and how the choices that they make affect so many people around them, when they're aware of that, the organization runs much better, right? So now I'm experimenting with this idea of what kind of practices would help us achieve greater mindfulness, greater observational clarity about interactions between different people and organizations, and also encourage us to experiment to deliver really valuable things that help lots of people. So those two things, I think they're compatible. But I definitely feel like in this one, that's the frontier that I'm operating in right now, because I don't see a lot of people combining these two concepts.
Yeah. Okay. And there's an interesting complementarity there for me in that the agile stuff seems very external, material, how we are in the world. And the mindfulness side is more how we relate to ourselves and other people. It's more of the internal, I would say, internal specific to one person, but then also intrapersonal, related to another person. And so of course you would want to have both of those to be holistically happy and successful. But then the last thing you said, and I'm really hoping you're going to give me a great answer here for our listeners. You're like, oh, I'm experimenting with some practices of how to combine these. And so can you tell us some of the practices that through your work and your experience in your life you've learned about, and you can share them with us, and our lives will be forever changed for the better?
Even though I'm in the middle of this giant experiment, can I do that?
Preliminary results.
Yeah. So one of the things that we have been doing, I'm bringing up some stuff. so my background also in Agile is one of the things that I was very interested in that not that many colleagues are interested in is if we take Scrum, which is all about work, and we expand it or think of Scrum as an Agile technique, and then expand it to think about what are some other Agile techniques. So lean startup is an obvious one because they can both be used together in the same types of companies. But then I looked at what were the characteristics that unify these two, right? So the experimentation element is a unification, a unifying idea. Metrics, of course, are also unifying for all of these things. And this shared sense of purpose, this driving purpose can lead to better results on both sides of that, right? So those are there. I called those the Agile canon, the set of fundamental axiomatic elements, I guess, of Agile. But then so I've started folding in some ideas that I think are important in organizations and people who want to be Agile, but do it in a mindful way. So one of the first one is exploring interdependence. So, and some of that is meditative. So you're familiar with meditation, of course, and so am I, but guided meditations that focus on concepts related to Agile don't exist, except perhaps for the ones that we're building. And so exploring interdependence in terms of how individuals interact with each other, how teams interact with each other, and how we are essentially responsible for almost everything around us. That's like the big challenge, is to get people to say, okay, yeah, Donald Trump got elected. Can I be responsible for that? In a sense, we can. We can say, well, I didn't drop everything and devote my life to not, to helping people not vote this dude in. And so I am partially responsible. If you are in that state of mind, you can actually say, I'm okay with that. As much as I wish Donald Trump wasn't there, I wanted to make sure that my family was happy and healthy. And I was going to focus on that. That was my first concern. But I'm not going to be one of those people that says, don't blame me. I voted for Hillary, right? I just think that is the lamest possible excuse, right?
Yeah, no, I love that emphasis on personal responsibility. And it's true because then we can't have that. I don't know. I'm sure there's some kind of German word for this where you just like hate yourself because of this choice you made, where it's like, it is, we had priorities and everyone was acting according to their priorities. And sure, you didn't like the outcome, but you made at some level a choice of like, okay, I'm not going to quit my job and campaign for Bernie or whatever for 6 months. And this is what happened.
Right. So, but exploring interdependence is a way of creating greater objectivity about how we can get more done. And it relates to that discussion about the LA County Department of Health, right? So when we explore our independence, we realize we're all in it together for something. I guess it must be some shared purpose. And you can actually derive what is the shared purpose without anyone actually telling you. You can reveal that.
Just empirically, as looking at the intersections of each person's purpose.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you can look at an organization and you can see, am I here to enrich shareholders or the CEO, or am I actually producing something that is helping other people also, or whatever it is. So that exploring interdependence is kind of a first principle. And then a second principle that arises from that is strengthening our ability to make decisions. So that relates to reduction of reactivity. So reactivity is the rough definition for this is when we have an emotion, do we take action directly from the emotion? Does that translate into action? Or do we have some sort of delay where we can actually think about what do we want to do because we're mad? Or what do we want to do because we're humiliated? Or what do we want to do because of whatever emotion we might have, even elation? That if we can reduce that reactivity safely, reactivity had a value for us because there were lions and tigers and bears, and we had to wander around in the world, and our amygdala, which is our center of reactivity, would say, "Oh my God, bear, fear and run." So that was useful. But now, when we're having interactions with each other, and we have employment, and we're probably going to get a job if we get fired or whatever it is, then that crazy fear and that immediate reactivity is second arrow, right? We're going to stab ourselves if we let our emotions run our lives. So strengthening decision making in part is helping us with reducing reactivity, and meditation, focused meditation in particular, is very good with that. So this idea, the dumbest possible meditation, or the simplest possible meditation, is we sit there and we think about our breath, and then our minds wander and we kind of push our thinking back towards our breath. What's happening there is we're actually strengthening the neurons in our frontal cortex, and we're weakening the kind of distraction, fear, motive, the amygdala response. We see that in NMRs and MRIs that we do with meditators, that the frontal cortex has greater strength after that. So that's a second principle, strengthening decision making. And then the third principle that I think is still in this mindfulness camp is minimizing debt. And I don't mean just financial debt. I mean clutter that is around us, or, boat anchors of it. You're an engineer, so you know this. We have a thing called technical debt, which is we wrote a bunch of code and we were super sloppy about it, and it has bugs in it, and we don't want to go back, and we're dragging this thing, but we have to fix it every now and then. And it just continues to slow us down all the time. And so there is this notion that if there are things that are unnecessary, that if we can get rid of them, we create freedom. And Buddhism actually has a lot to do with that too. That notion that when we carry around ancient emotions or regrets from past interactions that are potentially irreparable, like mom treated me bad, but now mom is no longer living and I still feel bad. There's a lot of that going on, right? That's kind of a big drag on our ability to contribute to the rest of the world. If we can minimize that debt, that's really great. And so one of the things that I do, and many people do, you may do it too, is minimizing. So that whole minimalist ethic, where we have just the stuff we need and we don't have more than we need. I love that, and it helps me, it gives me freedom to choose, even potentially radical choices about where to go next. And then the last thing that I think of in this sort of mindfulness contribution to Agile is taking responsibility. And it's really more of an attitude about never denying that, you always saying that I have choices about what I can do. And if something happens around me, I could have done something, but like you said, and I say, we have priorities. We're going to make decisions about what's right for our situation. And we may choose wrongly because of what we knew at the time or our particular biases at the time. But we also have self-compassion where we say, you know what, I made a wrong choice there. If I am faced with that situation again, I'm going to do something different. Or I made a wrong choice there. I'm going to change the structure of my life so that that sort of thing doesn't happen again. So if you're around highly reactive people, or if you're around, like, let's say drugs, like you decide to get addicted to heroin, like, well, okay, the people around you are part of that decision-making process. So you can decide, I'm going to not be addicted to heroin anymore. And part of the issue is I got to change who my friends are. That's got to be a thing. So, anyway, I don't want to say I'm totally anti-drug because, we're all exploring psychoactives and stuff like that, or not all of us, but some of us. But at the same time, there are third rails that we don't want to touch.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's also, for me, at least, I want to highlight that I don't think it's necessarily so simple to just decide to quit an extremely addictive substance. It's not. I think there's maybe some other steps in there.
Yeah, I'm glossing over the steps.
Cool. I just wanted public service announcement in there. Okay, fabulous. Thank you for that recap. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So all I'm saying is that when we start with those four agile, I think of them as preparatory principles because they're things that we are building kind of an infrastructure of strength from which to make agile decisions. Without that infrastructure, we're either going to make less wise decisions, or basically less wise decisions, or we may damage some long-term future that would be possible otherwise. So, but like I said, we're experimenting with this. This is our working model for what are the four principles that you have to have in order to have a mindful agile practice, but things may change.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks for integrating that and capturing, highlighting some of those techniques that people can do on a daily basis or on a moment to moment basis. There's a couple other questions that I like to ask, and maybe I'll eventually just ask these in the beginning, but
you can move stuff around as much as you want.
So far, I haven't done that, but this podcast is called 10,000 Heroes. It's about social transformation through individual transformation. And my version of that is everyone stepping into their own heroism, living their purpose, aligning themselves with how they can best contribute to the all. So given that definition, I'd love to hear someone who you consider a hero.
Wow. Someone I consider a hero. There's so many of them. I think there might be more than 10,000, but I'm not really sure.
Well, maybe just one, and one way in which you'd like to be a little bit more like that person, or something you would take from their example.
I'm going to be a little bit more nuanced than that and say that I have heroes and all of them have flaws. So one of my heroes is Jeff Sutherland, who is the person that developed Scrum. He became a friend over time, and that is because I am a crazy extrovert. So I said, why didn't I know this before? Scrum, this is amazing. And then I did everything I could to learn about it. I ended up at a Scrum conference about 6 months later, and there I am on a bus, and Jeff Sutherland is on the same bus. And I said, oh my God, this is crazy. I have to sit next to this guy because he developed this technique. So I sit next to him and I have conversations with him. And, I did everything I could to hang out with him. So I said, can I volunteer to help you with your courses, wherever they are in the United States? And he said, sure. And I'm going here. And I talked to my boss. I had a boss then after my startup failure. And I said, it's going to be really helpful if I hang out with Jeff Sutherland and teach his course. So I think you should pay my salary and also pay my flights and get me to hang out with him, which I did. And ultimately we wrote a couple of papers together, and it was just I'm so grateful for Jeff Sutherland being on the planet because I learned these techniques from watching and helping him teach. So that's one of them. And then how many others do we need? I suppose they're all like this, right? They're all people who inspire us to do more. And there are even little heroes, right? Like there's a guy named Miller. I'm going to have to look him up though. So we're going to delay just a second here. And I guess I go to Twitter because I know he's in here. And Miller, John Miller. So John Miller is a Scrum guy, and he went into high schools and he taught high school classes how to use Scrum to learn better. And so I just think that was just a little contribution. I think he did it for a few years. He is a really smart guy and he just inspires me knowing that he did that. And now he's doing mostly corporate stuff, but he did go into UC Berkeley and he taught some teams at UC Berkeley how to use Scrum for educational purposes. So just knowing him, it just makes me feel great.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. And then what is one way in which you, at the current moment, could become more heroic in terms of your own personal journey and your definition of heroism? Yeah, I don't know. It's like maybe it's a challenge that you've got to solve, or it's a way you could be more in alignment with what you know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm aiming towards is interacting more with the mindfulness community. And in doing that, it's sort of inviting guests to the podcast who are guided meditation teachers or people who study mindfulness academically, other stuff like that, but helping them touch the world of work. And the reason I am interested in that, I'll give you an example of someone who has done that. So Mark Benioff, I don't know if you know that name. He is the CEO of Salesforce.com. He is a mindfulness practitioner, really big in so when Thich Nhat Hanh was ill, he's a famous Buddhist monk who largely was in France. He had a life-threatening illness, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago. He was a friend of Mark Benioff. And Mark, on learning of his illness, called up Thich Nhat Hanh and said, dude, UCSF is one of the best hospitals in the world for what you have. Why don't you come stay with me in San Francisco and get treated at the UCSF Medical Center? And Thich Nhat Hanh said, okay, can I bring my entourage with me? And he said, how many are we talking about here? 40 monks. He said, I can make that work. The dude has lots of money. Anyway, brings these monks in. I don't know if they're staying in Mark Benioff's house, but they're certainly staying nearby. And the monks are doing their practice every day. And the monks come to Mark and say, hey, Mark, we think that you can have an influence on people's lives in what you're doing. And he said, okay, what are your thoughts? They said, we want you to put a meditation floor in all your buildings. The top floor should be a meditation center for your employees. He said, He thought about it for a minute and he said, I can't do that with the top floor. But what I can do is I can put a meditation room on every floor. And they said, that sounds good to us. So they worked out this deal. And I believe Salesforce.com now has a meditation room on every floor of the building. it does turn out that Salesforce.com was one of the earliest adopters of Scrum. And so I think of Mark like a hero. If you asked about a hero, at first I talked about a close personal hero. And now there's this more abstract hero for me, who is Mark Benioff. Like, it's amazing that he is thinking that far, where he's thinking about the overall well-being of his company. And he does think about how the workplace is such a major element of our lives that making it a source of mindfulness could be transformative. So now then I go to the meditation guides idea. You asked me what I would like to do. I think at the moment, I am trying to reach out to more folks in the meditation community to help them understand what Agile practice is and try to figure out ways to use mindfulness to infuse these ideas to magnify the effects of people who use their guidance, to use not just mindfulness to reduce suffering, but also to magnify it by using these experimental techniques for making transformative change in society itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. That's the perfect integration of the kind of interior work of the mindfulness and the exterior efficiency work of the Agile techniques, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully it works.
Hopefully for all of us, right?
I don't know what you were expecting. Was this fun?
Yeah. Let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for being on the show, Dan.
Hey, I am so grateful to be here and to meet you and learn more about you. Maybe we can have you on the Mindful Agility podcast someday.
That concludes another episode of the 10,000 Heroes Show. Thanks again for listening, and I hope that this has contributed in some small way to your own personal journey of heroism. I'd like to give a shout out to Pierre for the episode artwork, DJ Plainview for the theme music, and to our producer-editor, Martine. This podcast is sponsored by Momentum Lab, our year-long coaching program providing insight, accountability, a community of excellence, and one-on-one support. I encourage anyone who's intrigued to go to whatismomentumlab.com and explore. Finally, I love communication. If this episode has impacted your life in any way, let me know. Our email is info@10kh.show, and there's other ways to contact us in the show notes. Thank you, have a wonderful day, and take care.